Hello, welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for so very, very many reasons. I apologize for the late start. Marie will be joining me in just a moment, as she has been for the last few weeks. Sometime between last week and today, StreamYard, which is the software that we use to do this stream, updated. So when I logged in to do the stream today, I had to do an update, which delayed us. And that's why I'm starting, even though Marie's not here yet. She'll be joining momentarily. Uh, this is the This Is Not Therapy Hour, which is just my fun way to be clear that this is not therapy. It's just an open conversation. It's just here, time for us to chat. Marie and I will be having a conversation. We pick a topic every week. Today's topic is the loss of a loved one, I believe. I'll have to check with Marie when she hops on here in a minute. But it's a conversation, and like any other. Hi, Marie. I took us live already, so as soon as you add yourself to the stream, you'll be on live. So just add yourself when you're ready. I'm doing the little caveats. Yeah, just an open conversation. I can add you if you're ready. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, StreamYard updated sometime between last week and this week. So when I logged in to set it all up, I had to relog in and reset things up. So it delayed us a bit. But good to have you. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing all right. I was just doing all the opening stuff. So yeah, this is just conversation, which means those of you who are here in the chat, whatever you say, we see and we respond to. And if that takes us off of the chosen topic, that's okay. But we do have a chosen topic and some questions which I haven't looked at. And yeah, that's enough. I'll stop there.
Okay.
Marie, what's our topic today? What are we talking about?
So today's topic is grief, but not just grieving over the loss of a loved one, but the ending of a friendship, relationship, or anything else that's of importance to you. So I guess most people are familiar with the 5 stages of grief, as defined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I wonder if we could start there and maybe talk about those.
Sure. Yeah, the Kubler-Ross model. Yeah, absolutely. So that 5 stages, I'm not sure that I could say them in order off the top of my head, but I want to say it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Is that the correct order?
Yes, I think so.
And the Kubler-Ross model is obviously a useful one. It resonates for people. There's a reason we talk about it. This is one of those things that kind of like Freud's theory of the subconscious and stuff like that, where it's like these are just people's theories, but then they get so popular and so widely discussed that they're talked about as though it is the proper, like it is how things work.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't. And especially if we're talking about neurodiversity, right? Like the whole point of people being here is that we respond to things differently. If we emphasize that grief should go in 5 stages and it's these 5 stages in these 5 order, or in this particular order, not everybody is going to grieve like that. It is not necessary to grieve like that. That's just a commonly helpful model for people. So keep that in mind, because otherwise people will say like, oh, you just skip straight to acceptance. You didn't go through the anger, you didn't go through the bargaining, the denial. You're hiding something, whatever. It's like, no, sometimes people can do it differently. But I do like, not necessarily, I mean, I like it well enough. I just like that there's a framework. It's very helpful for people to have an understanding of like how you feel is going to change over time. So that however you're feeling right now doesn't mean you'll feel that way forever, especially when it comes to grief, can be very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really important as well. And as you're saying, especially as a neurodivergent person who may, I guess, process emotions differently or feel emotions in a more intense way. Sometimes grief can be quite a lot. Well, grief is difficult for anybody, but it can be, I think, quite a lot when you're thinking about, oh, I should be grieving like this, or I should be, responding X, Y, or Z way, the way we're expected to respond. So,
right.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make from the outset.
I should say too that I don't know a lot about the Kubler-Ross model, so I don't know. My guess is, as just because this is usually the case with stuff like this, my guess is that it was intended for a particular specific usage, like in response to getting a diagnosis of a terminal illness or something like that. Like that it was intended for some specific subset, but then got generalized. I don't know. I don't know a lot about it.
Okay. So yeah, we'll just use it, I guess, as a framework, as you say.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's those 5 stages. Is there a difference between grieving and mourning?
Well, so the language, right? Like it depends on what people mean. Another very popular way of conceptualizing grief that's much more recent from the TV show WandaVision. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
What is grief if not love persisting?
Yes. Yeah.
Which I like. It depends on what you mean, but I think there is typically when we're talking about grief, it's more about the irreversible loss of something, right? Like that it's coming to grips with that a thing which was important to you will no longer ever again be real or the same.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas mourning, I think, typically is used to refer to kind of the period of time through, in which you're dealing with the actual like emotional and mood elements of that loss. Like, I guess what I would say is, and again, language, people use it differently based on like colloquial usage. This is just my guessing. Is that like 20 years after a loss, you could still say, I'm grieving that loss. You probably wouldn't still say that you're mourning that loss, but you could.
Yeah, that's true. And I suppose like in different cultural traditions, there are kind of set mourning periods that are kind of observed, or at least historically they were. So there might be a kind of
There's definitely like a performative element where grief is more of a private experience. But again, I don't think these are like official definitions of these words, Yeah, mourning is like I'm displaying my grief, but grief is what I am experiencing.
Yeah. Coming back to the 5 stages, I suppose if you find yourself stuck in one of those 5 stages, you can't get past the denial or the anger or bargaining or etc. How would therapy help you to process that?
Well, so I'll reiterate, not an expert in this model, and I would bet that people who do know it better would bring a lot more nuance to the conversation and say, I'm guessing they would say things like, this is not a sequential, like you do one, then the next. It's you go back and forth and constantly mixing things up, and sometimes you're 2 at once and blah, blah, blah. That's my guess of what they would say. I could be completely misinformed here. So I wouldn't think of it necessarily as getting stuck, because even talking about it as being stuck presupposes that there is a proper way of moving through this, right? Mm-hmm. That if you get to bargaining and then just keep bargaining, well, now you're stuck. Actually, it's a very like Freudian arrested development, right? The Freudian model relies on the idea that there is a relatively universal process of development, and that various things, mostly pathological or traumatizing things, can get you stuck in a certain period of that development so that you can't advance onto the next natural element. Which, now that I think about it, I bet the Kubler-Ross model comes from that psychoanalytic theoretical background, but I don't know. I would be curious to know. Anyway, if we're just talking about processing, then therapy can help in the same way that therapy can help process anything, right? That each of us have an ability to process through, I guess we should define process as one of those words that we use in a lot of different ways, meaning to take a thought, a perception, a concept, and change to some other version, some related thing, right? That's the version of processing we're talking about. From, oh no, this is terrible, to, okay, it's terrible, but I can live with it, or whatever that change is. You can do that in your head, but you have a limited ability to do it in your head, and you get stuck on things. And when you get stuck on things, to get unstuck, you need to talk about it out loud with somebody else more often than not. And so therapy can be helpful in that way generally. But especially right now, I would guess that, do you know about this, the prolonged grief stuff in the DSM, Marie? It was talked about online a lot. I know you spent a lot of time following that kind of stuff.
I know that in my own experience, I did see a therapist after the breakdown of a particularly important relationship, and I was told I had complicated grief or prolonged grief. So maybe it's the same thing.
Could be, but if that was, this is a relatively recent thing, so that would have been an earlier, I'm guessing. I don't know when it was. I don't
Years ago.
talk about the specifics, but this has been a very recent thing, is that in making additions to the DSM, or changes to the DSM, which is the book where mental disorders and things are listed, that they added I can't remember if they call it prolonged grief or something like that. And there was a ton of debate about this. In fact, interestingly, grief is the example that Freud used when talking about neuroses way back in the day, to distinguish neuroses from just unpleasant experiences, cognitive and mental experiences, to say that he used grief as his example to say that you can be depressed more or less and it still be appropriate if you're grieving, whereas at other times, if you're depressed, that would be neurotic. That's his terms that he come up with. They mean different things now, but neuroses and neurotic was just his version of mentally ill, basically. That's reductive, but blah blah blah.
I get you.
So there's a lot of debate over, can grief become something diagnosable? Should it be helped in a certain way or addressed in a certain way? And I don't actually know exactly where they ended up with that, but I believe they added it, and I think it's something like 6 months or something like that. I'd have to look it up. Again, go ahead.
So 6 months from beginning to end, or 6 months before it begins to soften and become something you can...
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
And I could be wrong about the 6 month figure too, but that's why it's under so much debate, because some people will say, well, look, there is a relatively normal process of grief, relatively, expectable things that can happen. And if it's not going that way, people should have access to support. And then other people who will say in response to that, like, no, grieving is a normal thing and we shouldn't pathologize it. And the response is, well, then you can't diagnose it and the insurance won't cover it and blah, 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 blah. It's complicated. It's inevitable. Grief is inevitable. And I find much more useful ways of talking about grief than the standard kind of existing models. But that's just me. I always have my own little take on things.
Well, we should talk about that.
Sure. I actually do like that WandaVision quote.
Yeah.
So there's another quote, and I can't remember who this one is from. I want to say like Walt Whitman or some literary figure, but I could be completely wrong, where they're saying that a good friend of theirs had just passed. And the quote is something, I'm really badly butchering it, but something along the lines of, it's not the loss of my friend that I'm grieving. It's the fact that that friend brought out a certain part of me that will now never be brought out again. And so
Like that.
I find that to be a useful and kind of a beautiful way to talk about grief. Douglas Hofstadter, who wrote I Am a Strange Loop, which I talk about but have never actually read because I don't read these books. You hear me use the term mental models a lot. Douglas Hofstadter talks about that. And from what I understand, without having to actually read the book, his concept of grief is, think about it as cognitive miser theory, right? The brain doesn't spend resources unless there's a reason to. And it is obviously useful, efficient, important for us to create mental models of other people. So I have a mental model of you, Marie. I don't actually know you. I'm incapable of knowing you. I cannot know the full embodied experience that you have moment to moment phenomenologically, right? I just have a very reductive model of who you are, most of which is drawing on my ideas of what people are, or what Irish people are, or women, or friends, or coaches. Like we're kind of creating a pastiche, pulling all these different things together. And then some of it is specific knowledge I have about you specifically. But that's very, very little, right? The person you know more about than anybody else by a million miles is yourself.
Yeah.
And so no one ever is going to be as real of a person in terms of how my brain is able to conceptualize it as I am myself. Everyone's some reduced version of that. And yeah, I'm subbing in the things I know about Marie. I think of it like a loading bar. I don't know why.
Okay.
This is the visual image. It's a vertical loading bar where like pieces get filled in. And it starts with the things I know about Marie specifically, but then I can't deal with only like tiny little slivers of a person. So the other parts get filled in with other things that seem appropriate. And the last thing that always fills in the rest is me. That's true for all of us. This is part of like fundamental attribution error. It's all these different cognitive biases. Is unless I have specific information to suggest otherwise, I'm going to assume that your experience is the exact same as my experience, because how would I know any different unless I have information otherwise? So anyway, what I understand Hofstadter's model of grief to be is I invest in these mental models. My mental model of my wife is more robust, more detailed, more I interact with it more, I update it, I modify it more than anybody else, than any other mental model I have. Maybe my kids are all up there at the same. Whereas my mental model of you, Marie, is much less detailed and specific than it is for my wife and kids, as I would say it should be. And that grief then is, all right, let me clarify. Not all of this is Douglas Hofstadter stuff. A lot of it is, and then some of it's my little spin on that. I'm not saying that to take credit. I'm saying that because I don't want anyone to think that I'm speaking for somebody else when it's not really them. I've invested resources into that because it's useful. Not that I'm making this cold and clinical calculation, just when we're talking about an individual as an organism, it has to be useful to spend those resources. Well, when that mental model no longer is useful to me, that's inherently upsetting because I have invested a lot into creating, a lot of my resources have gone to this and now it's no longer useful. So there's that, but that to me is a little more sterile. Mm-hmm. The part I like to think about is when you're not with, I'm not with my wife right now, right? I'm talking with you, I'm here. So if I think about her, all I'm really thinking about is my mental model. If I imagine, oh, I should tell her this thing, then what I'm doing is in my head, I'm running a scenario with my mental model of her wherein I say this thing, and the response that the mental model is giving back is one that, is grateful or glad that I'm telling her this thing or finds it useful. In reality, I might go and tell her and she might be like, I don't care. Why would you tell me? Right? But we can't do that. We have to have an idea of what other people will find interesting. Because even if I am with you right in front of you, I can't tell you every single thing I've ever known. Like some things are going to come up and some things are not. And we're evaluating it that way.
Based on our prior relationship and what we deem to be relevant.
Yeah. And making projections, including by filling in the gaps with ourselves or with other people or with categories that you belong to or whatever. Right. But part of what is included in that interaction with the mental model is the knowledge that it is a model, that it's not real. Meaning the more you do that, the more effort you put into rehearsing a conversation or thinking about what you're going to do or how they're going to respond to something, the more the distress grows of, but I need to check this. I need to see, because I don't want to update the mental model based on responses I'm getting from the model. I want to take those responses, check what the actual person's response is, and then update the model to be more accurate to reflect who they really are. Otherwise, I get into, and we do this all the time, I'm just making my mental model more and more and more of a caricature of what I think. If I'm taking well, if I said this, they'd say that. Ooh, I knew they'd say something like that. That's like, because they're such a jerk. When in reality, they might not at all, right?
Right.
So if I'm thinking about somebody else, then there's some element of that thinking, which is a desire, a drive to actually interact with that person. And the more that I do it, the longer I invest into it, the stronger that drive gets, to the point where it can become all consuming. We've all been there, right? Like our whole head is just like, oh, we're so in our head about a conversation we need to have or want to have with somebody, but haven't had yet, that nothing else can exist. Well, when that person dies, I can't update the model anymore.
Yeah.
I can still think, oh man, my grandpa would have loved this, but I can't actually check to see if he actually would have loved it. So every time I think about them, there's a little bit of that distress that's added of like, oh, I want to check. Oh, and people will say this, right? That my first thought was to call my mom before I remembered, no, she's dead. And how like that, the bottom can just drop out from underneath you because you're so used to just, hey, oh God, no, they're not here.
Yeah.
So there's an inherent distress in like wanting to interact with that person because you still are in your head. You still use them as part of your way of interacting with the world. Just like every word I've ever used, I learned from somebody somewhere, right? So every time I use it in a way, I'm only able to interact with the world in that specific way, in part because of that person who shared that with me. And the bigger someone is a part of my life, the more my ability to understand and interact with the world relies on my concept of them, which is why I invest more and more into that model and why it hurts more and more if they're all of a sudden gone. So that part is terribly sad and inevitable. But I think here's the part that seems beautiful to me is a mental model is just a schema, a collection of information about some central topic that links all of those pieces of information. And it atrophies, right? Like you learn a language, if you don't use it over time, you start to lose it. You learn to play a game. If you don't play that game anymore, you forget how to do it. So if I have a mental model of somebody who then dies, over time, that stuff goes away. It's not a good use of the resources according to the way that my brain and body function to keep revisiting it over and over. It's miserable. And people will talk about this too, right? Like where they'll say, I don't want to stop being sad because if I stop being sad, that means that they're really gone.
Yeah.
I don't want to move on because it means I'm forgetting about them. Things like that, which is tragic and heart-wrenching and hard to talk about. But eventually you don't want to be sad anymore. Even if consciously you want to be sad, you just can't. You have to, if you're going to persist, there are things you have to do day to day. You have to eat food, you have to clothe yourself, which again, people will talk about in cases of grief. Just getting out of bed and getting through the day was a chore, and it is. But you can't think about the person every single moment. And so it does atrophy. But the parts that stick are the parts that still are relevant to your life. Yeah. So my grandfather died when I was 17 years old. One of my grandfathers died when I was 17 years old. And I just don't think about him that much anymore. But when I do think about something that makes me think of my grandfather, it's because that thing is also relevant in some other way. If I go bowling, my grandfather loved bowling, right?
Yeah.
So as opposed to keeping some mental model of them locked in place, static, and continuing to pour all these resources into maintaining this, revisiting it constantly, got to remember this, got to remember that, got to stick with it all, which gets me locked into that grief. What kind of happens is a natural dissolution of that model. And a lot of it gets lost. But the parts that don't get lost, they stick because they're parts of other models, other schema, other things that I'm doing. In other words, parts of them have now become parts of me.
Yes.
That if I like bowling because my grandfather and I used to bowl, or even not, I don't care about because, if I like bowling and my grandfather and I used to bowl together, then every time I go bowling, I think of my grandfather. but it can lose some of that terrible crushing sadness to it and shift into an appreciation, because I'm not thinking about it because I'm thinking of my grandfather. I'm thinking of my grandfather because I'm thinking of it. So each person we meet, they change us, they become part of us. And over time, after we no longer interact with them, that all falls away except for the parts that stick with us.
Yeah.
It's kind of like we're absorbing pieces of them. And again, this is not new. I'm just using different language. We all say, like, you keep them in your heart, or
Mhm.
every time you do X, they'll be with you, or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just a more cognitive science laden way to talk about that.
Yeah. I like that. Whenever I smell honeysuckle, I think of my grandparents because honeysuckle grew along the verges near their house. And
Yeah.
so I always have that. I'm immediately reminded of them
I love
and
that.
of the goodness that surrounded them. So, yeah. And yeah, you take a part of them with you. You keep a part of them with you when they go.
Yeah. They changed you. You
Yeah.
wouldn't have thought of them if they didn't.
So, say then you're grieving the loss of a person or friendship or something where the relationship wasn't um, that positive, or where things ended on a sour note. Say things are a little bit more complicated and you've got all these mixed up negative emotions along with the grief of the loss of the person. How does one process that, or are there different is there a different way of dealing with that?
I think when we're talking about this stuff, the question, how do you process it, is more a question of describing a process than it is about what should a person do. Like,
Mm.
what should someone do to process it? I don't
Yeah.
know that there's how to answer that, but we can talk about what is the process of processing it, even if you
Okay.
don't have to do something about it, right?
Yeah.
Because you got to look at, why was it important for you to have that mental model? And
Mhm.
if the reason it's important for you to have that mental model is because they're your asshole boss who sucks, and all you need to know is how to avoid pissing them off, then when they're gone, you're probably not going to be that sad about it. But if it's your asshole parent that, yeah, was shitty to you, but also there's some good stuff in there, and also a lot of the way that you view and interact with the world is still based on things that you got through your model of them, your interactions with them, then you can't just let it go. My asshole
Right.
boss dies, I'm done. Why would I think about that person anymore? My asshole mom dies, then okay, fine, yeah, screw her, she's an asshole. I'm not talking about my real mom. My real mom is A, alive, and B, lovely person. No one's perfect, uh, but if my asshole mom dies, I can't let go of all that, because still half of what I know about the world I got through her. And so I'm going to smell the honeysuckle and think of her, or whatever it is that's attached to her, right? So I don't know that there's something to do about it so much as it is just to understand that, like it or not, the more a person shapes your view of the world, your ability to perceive and interact with reality, like, they're a part of you. And we like that or we don't like that, and we can make changes and we can work on those things. But when someone's that important to you and they die, it's going to be hard, because you think about them a lot. Even if all we mean by think about them is think about things which are, like bowling, right? Which are part of the schema that is them, even though I'm thinking about it because it's part of a different schema that is relevant. It's still connected.
Mm.
I really think this is why it's so important, that first part of let go of the should. Like, there's no should. You feel how you feel. There's nothing wrong with feeling however you feel, unless you don't like it. In
Yeah.
which case, then the question is, what do you do to change it as best as you can to be more like what you want it to be?
I guess people talk a lot about unfinished business and not getting closure before the end of the relationship or the
Well,
death of a loved one.
if I was thinking about, if I was interacting with, if I haven't talked to my mom in 15 years, but I do still run things against my mental model of her, of like, ooh, one of these days she's going to ask me for forgiveness and I'm going to say this and she's going to react that way and blah, blah, blah. That part of talking about a lack of resolution or a lack of closure is I never got to test that.
Yeah.
I was working things up against my mental model of them that I never actually got to see how they would react. And now I will never know. And it could be something as minor as I'll never know if she would have liked that movie that I saw last week and was going to recommend to her, to I'll never know if she feels bad for what she did to me. Like, yeah. And again, inevitable. And so then the question is, if you don't like that feeling, that lack of resolution, lack of closure, the question is, what do you do to try and change it?
Yeah.
If you want to.
Yeah. If the person is no longer present for you to, as you say, test that theory, you have to find a way to, I guess, close that book somehow, if you want to.
And
So,
there's lots of different ways to do that.
yeah.
Sorry, you were going to ask a question.
No, I was just going to ask, what kind of ways are there to do that?
Well, so the big one is time, right? That eventually it just won't matter to you as much anymore because it's not as useful. Your brain will just shift resources to something else. It'll atrophy. Things will get better over time. One of the things that I've really liked, and I wish I was better about remembering where I saw different things, because I saw this somewhere and I don't know where, was pointing out that the intensity of grief often won't diminish over time, but the frequency of the experience will. That if you lose your spouse, 20 years later, when you think about them, it's going to hurt just as much as it did the moment after it happened. But 20 years later, you're just not going to think about them as frequently as you did the day after it happened. So over time, it just happens less frequently. And I think it can be less intensity, but sometimes it's not. I think with the people who are most important to you, it's not. Because really, well, I was about to get into some of my own personal philosophy that's a little like more out there, I suppose. But suffice to say, you are an amalgamation, right? Like we said, every word that you know, every experience you have, every perceptual set that you have, the fact that a tree is a tree to you came from other people.
Yeah.
So everything in your experience is a complex amalgamation of your ideas and understandings and perceptions of everyone else you've ever met. And the larger a part somebody is of that, the more inextricably linked they are to you. You cannot remove them from you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so there's different things to do. So time is a big one, and the frequency might decrease, the intensity might decrease. The frequency almost definitely will decrease. The intensity may or may not. That's one thing to do. Another is to symbolize, ritualize things. You can't interact with the person anymore, but you can interact with something that you can use as a visual or mental or conceptual representation of that person. Scattering their ashes. The ashes isn't them. Even literally speaking, it's not them. This is kind of gross and maybe not appropriate for this conversation, but like, they don't put bodies into they don't cremate a body and then somehow sift out which particular ashes are just from that body. It's a symbolic gesture, but that's a way to get closure, because again, it's your mental model. It's not the real person. So if you can say, Dad would have loved this, then you can feel a sense of closure instead of, I wonder if Dad would have loved this.
Yeah.
And you can do something like I've said my entire life. I mean, I don't believe in ghosts, for example. I don't have very specific thoughts about what there might be beyond observable reality, because if there is anything, it's not observable. So how would I have any opinion? Whatever.
Yeah.
But I don't believe in ghosts, meaning I don't believe that if there is anything there that it intrudes into our observable reality, because if so, I think there would be some evidence of that. And yet, if you go to a medium and you pay them $200 for a reading and you walk away from that an hour later with a sense of closure and resolution, how is that any different than if you go to a counselor or a therapist and pay them $200 and walk away from that meeting with a sense of closure and resolution? I don't give a, I almost I don't care what works for you.
Yeah.
If that experience, if that person can symbolically represent your lost loved one or channel them or whatever to give you some resolution and closure, awesome. So there's that. There's symbolic closure. It's not them, but it's something, you know, Dad loved this lake, so we're spreading his ashes at this lake, and that makes me feel like I have put him to rest, even
Yeah.
though Dad's not there anymore, or at least not in the way that you know him. Symbolic is one. Another is to learn to live with the discomfort, to learn to accept and process, like, it won't get resolved, and that's going to bother me, and it doesn't have to bother me all the time. And even when it bothers me, I can say, yeah, that's sad, that sucks, and just deal with it instead of thinking of it as something that needs to be resolved.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think culturally, well, a lot of cultures have a tendency to sanitize death and loss rather than facing up to it.
Yeah.
And acknowledging it as a natural part of life. It's something that should be engaged with rather than kind of put away in a box over there after X months and forgotten about and never spoken of again.
Yeah. Well, there's been a lot of like very poetic and evocative musing on the fact that life is only meaningful because it ends. If it was
Right.
infinite, then nothing would mean anything. But the fact that it's finite and therefore the things that we do matter, you know, that's what makes it meaningful. And I know we were talking about grief, not just in the case of death, but in the case of death specifically, part of what needs to be acknowledged in grieving is it reminds you that you're going to die.
Yeah.
That even if
Nobody
it is a
likes to
natural
be
loss,
reminded of
what's that?
Nobody likes to be reminded of that.
Yeah, it is inherently distressing because the one thing, and of course, you know, people can disagree with this, but I think it's a hard one to disagree with. The one thing that we can definitively say, the entire structure of your brain and body, everything about what I am, the one thing that all of that stuff wants to do is persist. Everything only functions because it's maintenance.
Mhm.
If I wasn't wired on a like subatomic level almost, if I wasn't wired to want to persist, if every system in my body wasn't designed to want to persist, then I would just die right away. Right. So yes, it is universally distressing to think about death. Obviously, some people don't find it as distressing as other people, but and certainly context and many things can shift that. But no, we don't generally want that. And because of how perception works, because of how humans are, when we see something happen to somebody else, it's happening to you. Because again, how do you have a frame of reference to understand somebody got punched in the throat? Oh, right? Like I have to reference what would that feel like for me in order to understand what it is that I'm observing happening. So we see death and we say, what must that be? And we have nothing to reference because it's the one experience that you can't have experienced. So then it's total unknown. There's nothing to do about it. In existentialism, it's one of the 4 universal fears, the fear of death. That one of the what existentialism proposes is that everybody is afraid of death among these other, the other 3 things as well. So that needs to be processed as well. That it's not just about the loss of a person, it's also of making me think about dying, which I don't want to die.
Yeah, and having to face up to the inevitable.
Yeah, which again is what gives it meaning. If you don't think about the fact that you're going to die at least sometimes, then you stop living in any kind of a meaningful way. Why would you ever do anything if you were never going to die?
I wonder if we applied that to relationships, would we pay more attention?
Meaning, if you think about it as this relationship will end.
This relationship could end or will end. Yeah.
Well, because of death, the relationship will end.
Will end. Yeah.
Sooner or later. Something that I've said to people for a long time, especially when talking about like romantic relationships, is like people will go through breakups and be like, oh, I wish I could figure out how to do this without it being a problem or blah, 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 whatever. It's like, that's not a thing. That's not a thing. You invested into a relationship for some reason and now it's gone. That you didn't want it to be gone or you wouldn't have been in it in the first place. By the time it's gone, hopefully you wanted it to be gone.
Yeah.
Hopefully it wasn't just pulled out from under you, although that happens. But even then, there was a reason you were in it in the first place. So I don't know. I think of that movie, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. You ever watch that?
Yeah.
I like that movie. Anyway, what I say to people a lot is every relationship that you're in your entire life is going to end badly, except for the ones that you're in that are going well when you die. And then they're going to end badly for the other party.
Mm-hmm.
They're all going to end, and it's always going to be bad. So yeah, the question is, what do you do in the meantime? But we don't always think about that. Just like with death, we don't always think about it because what we're really wanting is to avoid the end.
Yeah.
So when we think about it, we're saying, how do I make sure that doesn't happen? Instead of, well, it's going to happen. So what do I do? Even though I know that's going to happen. That's a very hard, like, cognitive dissonance to hold. I'm going to die, but I'm not dead yet. Like, what am I supposed to do with that?
So then when we are faced with the inevitable, it's a shock to the system. Yeah. I wanted to ask about, because we mentioned at the top of the hour, we mentioned being neurodivergent, and I guess this can affect how you process emotions or how you experience emotions.
Absolutely.
You have alexithymia.
Ooh, alexithymia. We should do a whole thing on alexithymia because I have a lot of thoughts on that. Actually, let's make a note to talk about alexithymia. Look, here's the thing about humans. Everything I'm about to say to you is a lie, but it's going to have an impact on you anyway, right?
Okay.
This Post-it note that I just grabbed off my desk, I keep it there. It's blank. There's nothing on it, right? I keep it on my desk where I can see it and access it because when I first started this company, when I first started this practice, my wife gave me some office supplies, among which was these different colored Post-it notes. And so, of course, I don't want it all cluttered all the time, but I kept one of them that I put there as just a blank note. It's just kind of a reminder to me of her faith in me, her belief in me, her willingness to support me. So in many ways, this Post-it note has come to represent like everything that I love about my relationship with my wife. It's almost like it is her to me, and it's a nice little reminder of that whenever I'm feeling down. How did you feel when I just ripped that up?
Yeah.
Even though I told you it was all a lie right before.
No, it was all a lie, but still. There's a comment in the chat here. This Post-it note is my wife.
I think that's meant to be said with a Borat accent, is my guess.
My wife.
Yeah, I told you all was a lie.
Yeah, I still kind of, I still felt a little
But we
jolt.
invest in this stuff because none of it's real anyway. It exists in our mind. When I tell you about suffering elsewhere in the world, you're not actually observing that. So any concept you have of it exists in your mind. The things that we think of affect us as though they are real because it's the only real thing that we know.
Yeah.
Even when I say, I'm just a good actor, I deliver the lines well, even though I say up front that it's all a lie, right? We just respond to tone and language and images and concepts that are evoked. So one of the ways in which things can be different for neurodivergent people is that it is not uncommon, especially for autistic, but I don't like to separate things into those buckets so much. It is not uncommon for neurodivergent people to have a stronger connection to inanimate objects, for example.
Yep.
That you ever see that cartoon, that animated movie, The Brave Little Toaster?
No.
Oh, it's just, I don't know, from the 80s, back when animated movies were just absolutely horrifying and traumatizing. Continues ripping up his wife. Yeah. Now it's become a fidget, and now I'm just ripping it as a fidget. I love ripping as a fidget. But I'll stop because that's bad symbolism. I don't want to give that. See, if I was a Freudian, then it would be like, oh. Anyway. Brave Little Toaster is just about like a toaster and a vacuum cleaner and the record or a radio and various objects that the owner leaves and never comes back, and they're abandoned, and they go on this big quest to go find their beloved owner or whatever. And it hits hard for some people. So neurodivergent people, have a tendency to have big feelings that there's not as much, and of course I don't ever want to talk about it like it's some clear distinction between neurodivergent people are like this and non-neurodivergent people are like this, because I don't even think that exists, but that there's not as much of a halfway. If I love somebody, I'm obsessed with them. You know, if I care about a game, I want to know everything about that game. I nerd out on stuff, right? So grief can hit especially hard in that way, that I theoretically might have fewer mental models across the board than somebody else, which would then mean that each of those mental models is that much more impactful, that much more that I've invested into it. And therefore, the loss of any one of those things might hit me a lot harder. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's also the one thing that we can definitively say about anybody who identifies as neurodivergent is that they consider themselves to be significantly different from the norm in some impactful way. So they must have a conceptualization of what the norm is, and it has to be different than what their actual experience is. And when it comes to things like grief, look, not to get too real on you guys here, and I'll keep myself out of the emotionality of it, even though it could get emotional for me. My cousin who taught me to play guitar and sing, a very important person in my life who committed suicide when he was, I shouldn't say commit, he died by suicide at 20 years old. And I remember being at his funeral and not crying and feeling like I should cry so that people think that I'm sad, even though I was very sad. And I remember hugging my aunt, his mom, and feeling like I should hug her in a certain way to convey to her the depths of my sadness. That can be an experience for neurodivergent people, as well as not only dealing with the grief, the sadness, whatever it is, but on top of that, then the importance of masking in that moment.
Yep.
Like masking, sometimes it matters more, sometimes it matters less. And it doesn't have to feel, this doesn't have to be a time when it's more important, but it often will feel like, oh my gosh, if I don't react in the right way, people will think I'm a monster. If I don't cry, they'll think I didn't care. And then you get in your head and then you're like, oh my gosh, I'm sitting here in my head worried about how people perceive me more than the fact that my cousin is dead now. And that's what's wrong with me. And then blah, 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 blah.
And then you start to spiral. Yeah.
Yeah. So just an example of how it can go. But that's one. Alexithymia can be part of that. But I'll say briefly about alexithymia. I don't believe that there is such a thing as an inability to identify or label one's own emotions. I do believe that there is a belief, which varies from person to person, whether you have this belief, and if you do, how strong it is, that there is the possibility of a belief that there is a correct way to identify and label emotions, and that the more strongly you hold that belief, the less likely you are to believe that you know how to do it. In other words, you feel something, you know you feel it. Otherwise, if you didn't know you felt it, then you didn't feel it, right? And we're not talking about a lack of emotions when we talk about alexithymia. People are very clear. I have emotions, I just don't understand them, which just means, in like linguistic terms and philosophical terms, we don't have a token relationship. We don't have a way to symbolize this experience. I can encapsulate with the word anger and use that to label it and express it. It's too complex. And oftentimes people who are struggling with alexithymia, I guess we should maybe clarify. Alexithymia is a term which means that a person has a reduced ability or an inability to identify and label their own emotional experience.
Yeah, that's the important word, identify, rather than the inability to feel them. It's
right.
The inability to identify what it is they're feeling. Right.
So the truth is that every time in my life I've ever been sad, they're not the same experience. There are some things about it which are in common, and so I can call it sad because it matches those markers. But if I'm paying attention to the full experience and how am I supposed to express this, what emotion is this? I don't know. I can't label this emotion. And then I end up feeling, if I'm based in that deficit model, like, I guess I'm bad at labeling emotions, instead of just embracing, like, no, that's not a thing that can be done accurately. It's a thing that can be done in a way which is potentially useful. And oftentimes people who struggle with alexithymia, they'll hear somebody, if they finally get to the point where they ask, what do you mean when you say anger? Like, how do you know you're angry or whatever? And someone else describes it, then they'll be like, oh yeah, I have that all the time. That's what anger is? I didn't think that's what anger was. Or one of my favorite questions for people is, when you say you're hungry, what experience are you having that you identify as hunger? Without using the word hunger, what are you thinking, feeling, noticing that you then identify as, oh yes, that's hunger that I'm experiencing?
That could differ for different people. Like, you might experience it as a emptiness in your stomach. You might experience it as wanting to taste something.
Yeah. Or my hands are shaky, or just an idea that I haven't eaten in a while and I should eat. Or I like asking that question because when people, especially I'm talking to people about neurodiversity all the time, and they're coming from this idea that neurodivergent people are different in some significant way from the rest of, neurotypical people. Again, not an idea that I think holds any merit, but it's useful and it's common and it's understandable. That they come into this with like, okay, so what does a neurodivergent person experience? And my question of, okay, well, what do you experience? What is hunger? And then they can't answer. I guess I've never thought about that.
Yeah.
When you're angry and when you're frustrated, those are two different things, right? Yeah. What's the difference? It's a lot of, you just know it when you see it, meaning it's not accurate. There's not an actual definable way. It's just an experience of it. So what's the difference between grief and mourning? It's up to the person. What are you supposed to experience? Nothing. There's no supposed to. What if you get stuck in? You're not necessarily stuck. Do you want to be there? If you don't want to be there and you're trying to get out, but you can't, then yes, you're stuck. But if you don't have any desire to change it, then you're not stuck. If someone's like, oh, I'm stuck at the grocery store, but you love being at the grocery store and you want to be at the grocery store, would we call that being stuck there?
Right.
Anyway, we got kind of off topic there. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So coming back to intensity of emotions and about neurodivergence, that intensity of emotion can be quite distressing. I guess my question is, are there ways to soften that intensity of emotion, techniques?
Oh, yeah. And our comment here from Bast Insider, I just read the second most recent one, which is a funny Freudian joke. I like that. Like, if you live more in your head than in your body, it's hard to recognize the feelings because your living space isn't changing, but your environment is. So I like that way of conceptualizing it, but I would even flip it too, that the body is the part of us that's consistent. No matter what I'm experiencing or thinking, my body, it's changing in minor ways moment to moment, but from 1 minute to the next minute, my body is not that significantly different. Whereas cognition, I can be fantasizing about, dragons flying through the air 1 minute and then crushing despair of having lost my grandfather the next minute. Completely, my world can change completely. So when we talk about grounding and like mindfulness, those kinds of exercises, those things, grounding is about getting back into your body, into the environment, because it's stable. Cognition is not stable. It changes rapidly, vastly, intensely. Reality, not so much. You can conceptualize it differently. You could take the same moment and be happy with that moment and then be angry at the moment, but it's because your conceptualization changes, not because the moment itself changed, right?
Right.
So intensity of emotion means that you have a lot of your attention, a lot of your resources directed at that emotional space, which is internal. So getting those resources redirected to something that isn't the emotion is really the only way to decrease the emotion. And one useful way, useful, one way that neurodivergent people especially will use commonly to do that is with cognition, that I feel something, but then I think something, and that changes the way that I feel now. I'm sad, but you know what? I'm better off. Well, now I'm not as sad. I can do it just by thinking. And that works.
Yeah.
It works the vast majority of the time, or you would stop doing it. We adapt very quickly. If it didn't work, you wouldn't do it. But sometimes it doesn't work. And if it doesn't, and you're somebody who mostly goes that way, fixes things in cognition, doesn't work, it actually makes it worse. Well, what do? I try and fix it in cognition even harder, which makes it even worse. So I try harder, it's worse. And I try harder, it's worse. And there are times that, yeah, there's a reason that there's stereotypes about, we got to get you out of here, man. Like, you are in your grief and we get it and it, whatever, but we got to get you out. Let's go somewhere and we got to draw attention away from that stuff. Sometimes leave me alone because I'm working through it and this is working for me. But sometimes it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And until I'm distracted or pulled away from it, I'm just going to keep looping.
Yeah. I think that actually answers another question that was on the list about, what happens if you are kind of stuck and you want to be around people, but you're kind of isolating. So I guess the question really is for loved ones, how do you support somebody who's sort of isolating themselves when they're grieving?
Communicate.
Yeah.
Invite. I tell people all the time, never stop inviting.
Yeah.
Hey, come out. No. Hey, come out. No. Hey, come out. No. The temptation is to say, okay, I'm bothering them by inviting. They don't want to come. I should stop inviting. And so then I stop. But if I do that, then if and when things change and they do want to come out, well, there's no invitation for them to respond to at that point. So the bar just got a lot higher. It's not about getting to a place where you can say yes. It's about getting to a place where you can initiate it, which is way harder. Yeah. And B, it actually puts pressure on that person to say yes to you even when they don't want to. Because if you say no and then I stop asking, which makes sense, like I said, from my perspective, I don't want to bother you. Obviously, you're not interested. I'm going to stop annoying you. Fine. But if I actually stop, then what you learn is if I say no to people, they stop liking me. If I say no to people, they stop inviting me to things. So now even if I don't want to go, sometimes I have to say yes. Whereas if you say no and I say, understood, I know it's a hard time. I'm going to call you in 2 hours and ask you again. Or whatever. You just keep trying. Don't put pressure. Don't be upset. Don't force anything. Don't imply that they should be behaving or feeling or thinking any differently than they are. Just stay present. Keep trying. And sooner or later, they'll say yes. And that's hard.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I was going to say, and they will probably be grateful that you did keep trying. They'll probably thank you. Hopefully thank you.
Yeah. Imagine if you just lost somebody, a breakup or a death or whatever, and now your closest friends and family are inviting you out. Hey, we got to do this. Hey, let's get you out of your head. And then those people disappear too because I was saying no for too long.
Yeah.
That's going to make it better? No, you're not pestering the person. Unless they say, you're pestering me, please leave me alone. In which case, listen to them. But even then I would say, okay, for how long? I'm not going to leave you alone forever because I care about you and I think about you and I am allowed to want to hang out with you. And I am allowed to ask you if you want to hang out with me. But I understand you don't want it right now. Just how long is a good time for me to wait before I start inviting you again? Mm-hmm. And if they say forever, you say, okay, not going to do that. But I understand I'm not going to ask you again. And then you just go back to them when you feel like you're ready to, or you do your best. But don't stop forever.
Yeah, don't give up on somebody who's going through something that difficult.
Yeah. All right, unfortunately, I got to get going on to another meeting. I'm sure we didn't get through half our questions. I got to be faster.
Yeah, there was a question there about gender and grief. But I think we could do a whole series on neurodivergency and gender identity. So maybe it's something
that would be awesome.
Yeah. All right. Well, good to see you.
Good to see you, Marie. And good to see you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Bass Insider, thank you. And we'll see you next week, same time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.